CHAPTER XIV Part I of History of the Christian Church during the First 6 Centuries. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Christian Church during the First 6 Centuries by S. Cheetham. Chapter XIV Growth of the Church, Part I. Christianity was largely diffused, without direct missionary effort, by the natural intercourse between different parts of the world. It followed the track of the Roman legions, and accompanied commerce from shore to shore. Wherever Christians were found, there was found Christian worship, and the curiosity which was excited about the new faith generally led to its extension. But there were also conversions of heathen nations of a different kind. The history of the foundation of the Abyssinian Church is strange and romantic. A Christian philosopher of Tyre, named Meropius, undertook a voyage of exploration in the direction of what was then vaguely called India. He was wrecked on the coast of Abyssinia and put to death, with the whole of the ship's crew, with the exception of 2 kinsmen of his, Frumentus and Edesius, who were spared on account of their tender age, and sent as slaves to the king of the country. There Edesius was made the king's cupbearer, and Frumentius the chief keeper of the public records. The king before his early death freed the 2 Tyrian slaves, who were entreated by the widowed queen to take charge of the young king, her son. Frumentius in particular acquired great influence, which he used to promote the settlement of Christian merchants in the country, and to procure them freedom of worship. When the king came of age, Edesius returned to Tyre, while Frumentius betook himself to Alexandria, where he besought Athanasius, then bishop of that see, to send priests to confirm and strengthen the new colony of the Church. Athanasius could devise no better method than to send Frumentius himself as bishop to Abyssinia, where he was called Abba Salama. King Azan and his brother were baptized, and the faith made rapid progress. During the Arian controversy, Frumentius remained faithful to the Catholic cause, and persuaded the king to reject an Arian patriarch whom the emperor Constantius wished to force upon him. It has been supposed that the ancient Ethiopic version of the Scriptures was made in Abyssinia in the 4th and 5th centuries, but from the general character of the version itself this is improbable, and the Abyssinians themselves attribute it to a later period. Lying remote from the general movement of the world, the Abyssinian Church has preserved some old customs which have elsewhere become obsolete. As some of these are Judaic, it has been supposed that the Abyssinians were converted to Judaism before they adopted Christianity, but this seems very improbable. Christianity had already reached Arabia in the previous period. Under Constantius, the Arian Theophilus of Diu is said to have had considerable success among the Himyaritic (Homerite) people in Yemen, and to have converted their chief, who built 3 churches. A Catholic king of Abyssinia, Elesbaan, is said to have conquered the country and restored orthodoxy in the 6th century. In the 4th and 5th centuries the monks and anchorites made a great impression on the nomad Arabs of the desert who surrounded them. In Persia Christianity had been introduced in the 3rd century, and had a metropolitan at Ctesiphon, the capital city. The revived Persian kingdom of the Sasanian dynasty was, however, by no means favourable to the faith of Christ. Its monarchs were generally anxious to revive the old Persian religion, and when their enemies, the Roman emperors, became Christian, the Persians regarded Christians as friends of Rome. Constantius in vain made representations to Shapur (Sapor) in favour of the Church within his dominions. A persecution began in the year 343, and lasted with more or less violence to the death of the king in 381. The aged bishop of Ctesiphon, Simeon, was one of the first victims of this outbreak. From Shapur's death to the year 414 was an interval of peace and quiet. King Yezdegerd, under the influence of Bishop Maruthus of Tagrit, was even favourable to the Christians and did all in his power to protect them from injury. This happy state of things was, however, brought to an end by the fanaticism of Bishop Abdus of Susa, who caused a fire temple of the Persians to be razed to the ground. The king, with many reproaches, ordered him to rebuild the temple, and when he obstinately refused, began a persecution which lasted several years, and in which many Christians suffered death under horrible torture. Theodosius II, however, after a victory over Bahram, Varanes, the son and successor of Yezdegerd, stipulated for the cessation of these fearful atrocities, and at the same time granted toleration to the Zoroastrians in the empire. In Armenia the Gospel was preached at an early date. Gregory the Illuminator, who is regarded as the apostle of Armenia, was succeeded in the primacy by his son Aristakes, who sat as bishop in the Council of Nicaea, and the primacy long remained in his family. Narses, called the Great, was recognized in the year 366 at the Synod of Valarshapad as Patriarch or Catholicus, and it was at the same time determined that the head of the Armenian Church should no longer be nominated and consecrated by the Archbishop of Caesarea, but by the Armenian bishops themselves. Isaac (Sahak), son of Narses, became patriarch about the year 390, and did much for the extension of the Church and for the regulation of its rites and ceremonies. It was in his days that we find the beginning of Christian literature in Armenia. Mesrab, Isaac's lifelong friend, had resigned the office of king's secretary in order to devote himself to solitary asceticism, but at the bidding of his friend had left his solitude to preach the Gospel in his native land. While he was thus occupied he found the need of vernacular scriptures, in which his converts might read in their own tongue the wonderful works of God. Up to this time the lections from the Bible were read to the people in Syriac, which they did not understand. This Syriac version Isaac and Mesrab undertook to translate. But when, in the year 431, their pupils Joseph and Esnach returned from the Council of Ephesus with a Greek copy of the Scriptures, Isaac and Mesrab threw aside what they had begun, in order to make a version from the Greek; but finding themselves insufficiently acquainted with that language, they sent Joseph and Esnach, with Moses of Corinne (Corinensis), who is the narrator of these events, to study Greek at Alexandria. The result was the extant Armenian version, though the present printed text probably contains variations introduced at a later period. End of chapter 14, part 1.